History's greatest empires were built on a shared language we no longer hear. This was not a language of words, but of measure. The quiet invention of standardized weights and lengths was a technological revolution more profound than many realize, an invisible infrastructure that made vast kingdoms possible. By watching this journey, you will understand how the simple act of agreeing on the length of an arm or the weight of a stone became the hidden blueprint for global power. How did societies separated by continents and centuries all stumble upon the same urgent need for order? And why did a pharaoh's forearm or a king's stone weight hold more authority than an army? The story of how we first measured our world is the story of how we first built it together. What forgotten tool of ancient power do you think still shapes our world today? Think of trying to buy cloth in a neighboring town, only to find their arm length for measuring was shorter than yours. The world before standardization was a mosaic of local truths, where every measure was a personal agreement quickly forgotten. A foot was literally the length of the local chieftain's foot, a standard that changed with every succession. A handful of grain was exactly that, varying with the size of the merchant's hand. This was not just inconvenient, it was a system built for mistrust. For a king trying to collect taxes, how much grain was versus the southern plains? The answer was different every time, creating constant friction and ripe opportunities for dispute. Long-distance trade was a gamble of interpretation. A trader from afar might agree to deliver 100 measures of olive oil, but whose measure? Upon delivery, the local buyer could simply declare their own larger jug as the true measure, leaving the trader with a loss and no real recourse. This inherent chaos made agreements fragile and empires impossible to manage. You cannot administer a vast territory, build coordinated armies, or fund large-scale projects if every transaction requires a lengthy negotiation over basic definitions. The weight of a stone, the length of a rope, the volume of a basket, these were the fundamental units of ancient economics and law, and they were all in fluent, confusing disagreement. This was the daily reality, a world whispering for a new kind of order. The solution to this chaos grew from the earth itself, from the very abundance that promised stability. In the fertile river valleys of the Nile and the Tigris and Euphrates, humanity first learned to produce more food than it could eat immediately. This agricultural surplus was the foundation of civilization, but it presented a monumental new problem of logistics. How does a community store thousands of baskets of grain without knowing if a basket from one field holds the same amount as a basket from another? How does a temple or palace distribute fair rations to workers, or calculate what portion of the harvest is owed as tax? The answer was not found in a grand decree, but in the practical need to count what could not be easily counted. The first true standards of measure were born not from trade, but from administration, from the need to bring mathematical order to the bounty of the land. In Egypt, this led to the creation of the hekat, a precise unit of volume for grain. Archaeologists have found cylindrical vessels marked with official seals, their capacity carefully calibrated. 1 hekat was calculated to be the grain ration for one adult for 1 month, a direct link between measurement and survival. Similarly, in Mesopotamia, the sila became a fundamental unit. Records on clay tablets show that a worker's daily wage might be 2 sila of barley, and the yield of a field was measured in hundreds of sila. This was measurement as a social contract. By defining a sila, a central authority could promise a fair wage and demand a fair tax, creating a system of trust built on consistency rather than personal whim. The humble grain measure became the instrument of state power, enabling the planning of large workforces for irrigation projects and monument building. It transformed food from a vague plenty into a countable, manageable resource. The ruler who controlled the standard measure, in essence, controlled the economy itself. This was the quiet, revolutionary first step, turning the chaos of local custom into the clear language of central authority. But grain was only half the equation. A kingdom also needed to measure the earth itself, to lay out fields, dig canals, and raise monuments that would touch the sky. For this, ancient civilizations turned to the most universal ruler they possessed, the human body. Yet they faced the same problem: my foot is not your foot. The brilliant, authoritarian solution was to declare one body supreme. Thus was born the cubit, the length from a man's elbow to the tip of his middle finger. But this was no ordinary man's arm. In Egypt, it became the royal cubit, a measure officially sanctioned and often believed to be based on the physical dimensions of the pharaoh himself. This was measurement fused with divine right. The pharaoh was a living god, and his body was the perfect template for order. His arm's length became the sacred standard against which all other lengths were judged, a physical manifestation of his power to bring harmony to the kingdom. To make this divine standard a practical reality, master cubit rods were crafted. These were not simple sticks of wood. They were permanent, unyielding artifacts of state power, carved from black granite or cast in bronze, materials meant to last for eternity. Inscribed with the pharaoh's name and often divided into smaller units like palms and digits, these rods were the ultimate reference. Exact copies were then produced and distributed to regional governors, head architects, and temple priests across the land. Imagine the symbolism. In a distant province, a surveyor holding an official cubit rod was not just holding a tool, he was holding a piece of the king's own body, a fragment of his divine authority. It meant the pharaoh's arm was literally measuring every plot of taxable land, every foundation stone for a new temple, every canal that brought life to the fields. Disputes over boundaries could now be settled by appealing to this unchanging standard. A builder in Thebes and a builder in Memphis were using the same sacred length, allowing for the coordinated, monumental architecture that defines ancient Egypt. The royal cubit did more than measure stone. It measured obedience, creating a unified spatial language that turned a collection of territories into a coherent, administrable empire. The king's body became the blueprint for the kingdom. With the royal cubit established as law, the pharaoh's next command could echo across the desert with absolute clarity. Build, the scale of ambition was breathtaking: pyramids that would pierce the heavens, temples that would awe for millennia. But such dreams rested on a deceptively simple foundation, the humble mud brick. Here, the power of standardization moved from theory to staggering reality. Every brick in a pyramid's vast core, every block in a city's defensive wall, was not a unique stone. It was a manufactured component, and its most critical feature was its consistent size. Official decrees specified brick dimensions as precise fractions of the royal cubit, perhaps 1 cubit long, half a cubit wide, and a third of a cubit thick. This was a logistical masterstroke. Think of it as the world's first assembly line, millennia before the factory. 1,000 brickmakers, spread across dozens of work camps along the Nile, could all produce identical units. They used wooden molds carved to the official standard, pressing in the same mixture of mud and straw. When those bricks were transported to the construction site, they fit together perfectly. A bricklayer did not need to chip or shape each one. He could simply take it from the pile and set it in place. This consistency multiplied human effort. It meant that teams of laborers could work simultaneously on different sections of a massive wall, confident that their sections would meet seamlessly. It allowed for the precise calculation of materials: how many bricks per layer, how many layers to reach a certain height. For the first time, architects could draft plans that would be executed flawlessly by workers who had never met them, speaking through the universal language of the standard cubit. The Great Pyramid was not just a tomb, it was a mountain of administrative precision, every one of its millions of blocks testament to a system that could command harmony from chaos. The monument rising from the desert was the ultimate propaganda, a physical declaration that the pharaoh's order was so absolute it could even govern the shape of earth and clay. Without that shared, unyielding measure, the project would have dissolved into a hopeless jumble of mismatched parts. Standardization did not just enable the empire to build, it was the very method of its expression. While the royal cubit measured the earth and brick, another, even more critical standard was needed to measure value itself. The true engine of empire was not just grain and stone, but trade, the relentless exchange of goods across vast distances. And trade demanded a universal language for weight. Consider a merchant from Anatolia arriving in Babylon with a load of raw copper. How does he agree on a price with a local smith? They cannot barter by the piece, as each lump of metal is a different size. The solution lay in finding a way to measure the very substance of wealth, its mass. This led to the invention of some of history's most enduring units, the shekel and the talent. A shekel was not a coin, but a specific weight, roughly equivalent to the mass of 180 grains of barley, a clever link back to that original agricultural standard. A talent was a much larger unit, often said to be the weight one man could carry, representing a significant fortune. But these abstract numbers were useless without a tool to physically realize them. The technological breakthrough was the balance scale, a simple lever with two pans. On one side, you placed your merchant's lump of copper. On the other, you placed official stone or metal weights that represented the shekel. When the beam hung level, you had a transaction based on a shared, verifiable truth. The integrity of the entire system, however, rested entirely on those little stones. A merchant carried his own set of weights, but how could a buyer in a foreign port trust them? This is where authority stamped its mark. Official weights were meticulously shaped from hard stone like hematite or cast in bronze, and they were often inscribed with the seal of the king or the symbol of a city's chief temple. That stamp was a promise. It declared that this weight of 1 shekel was true and had been verified against the master set held in the palace treasury. To use a fraudulent weight was not just cheating, it was an act of rebellion against the king's guarantee, a crime against the divine order that upheld commerce. A marketplace where everyone trusted the weights became a place where deals could be struck between strangers, where goods from the mountains could be valued against wool from the plains and silver from the mines. The humble, stamped weight was the foundation of international trust, the silent partner in every contract that allowed the first threads of a global economy to be woven. This promise of consistency required an entire bureaucracy of trust. To prevent a merchant's stone weight from being quietly filed down or a local governor's cubit rod from slowly shrinking over the years, ancient states developed the world's first system of quality control. The science of measurement, metrology, was born not in a laboratory but in the temple storeroom and the palace workshop, as a direct function of government. Authorities understood that the standard itself was meaningless without a way to verify it, to stamp it with the indelible mark of the king's guarantee. In Mesopotamia, this took a tangible and often beautiful form, the duck weight. These were heavy stones carved into the shape of resting ducks, their smooth curves making them difficult to alter without detection. Crucially, each one was inscribed with cuneiform text stating its exact mass and the name of the ruling king. A merchant presenting a duck weight in a distant market was not just showing a tool, he was displaying a portable piece of royal authority. The inscription was a legal document in stone, declaring that this weight had been compared to the master set in the capital and found true. In Egypt, the same principle applied to the tools of measurement. Archaeologists have discovered balance beams, the central bars of scales, inscribed with the cartouch of the pharaoh and the name of the official in charge of weights and measures. Imagine the ceremony of it. A state inspector would travel from town to town, bringing the royal standards. Local merchants and tax collectors would bring their own equipment to be tested against the master set. A cubit rod that had warped would be discarded. A set of weights that had worn down would be replaced. The official would then stamp or inscribe the approved tools, effectively licensing them for commerce. This regular auditing transformed measurement from a personal guess into a public utility. It created a network of certified truth that spanned the kingdom. To use an unstamped weight or an unverified measure was to operate outside the law, to reject the social contract that held the economy together. This administrative machinery, this metrological bureaucracy, was the hidden framework that made empires viable. It meant a farmer in the Nile Delta paid his taxes using the same volume of grain as a farmer 800 kilometers upriver. It meant a shipment of Lebanese cedar could be priced in silver shekels in Byblos and have that price honored in Memphis. The stamp of the king did not just guarantee weight and measure, it guaranteed peace, trust, and the flow of wealth. It was the signature on the contract of civilization itself. The ultimate expression of this principle was carved in stone for all to see. Around 1750 B.C., King Hammurabi of Babylon erected towering pillars throughout his realm, inscribed with 282 laws. This was not merely a list of crimes and punishments, it was a comprehensive blueprint for society, and woven through its entire fabric was the absolute necessity of standardized measurement. Hammurabi understood that justice itself could not exist in a world of shifting measures. His code legally fixed the fundamental units of economic life. Law number 94, for example, states that if a merchant lends grain or silver, he shall take 100 sila of grain as interest for every 300 sila borrowed. The law specifies the exact measure, the sila, leaving no room for a lender to use a larger vessel and claim a higher return. Similarly, prices for essential services were codified. The fee for a surgeon's operation, the hire of a boat, even the daily wage for a laborer were all set in precise amounts of silver, measured by the shekel. This was revolutionary. For the first time, a farmer taking a loan for seed or a family hiring a boat to transport goods could know the exact terms in advance, terms backed by the full authority of the king. Hammurabi was not just regulating commerce, he was building trust into the very structure of the empire. By eliminating the ambiguity of measurement, he eliminated a primary source of conflict. A dispute over a debt or a fair wage could now be settled by referring to the public stela, where the law in fixed measures was literally set in stone. This transformed measurement from an administrative tool into a pillar of justice. The code's famous principle of an eye for an eye is often remembered for its severity, but its true innovation was proportionality, the idea that a punishment must fit the crime. That same logic of proportion applied to economics. A fair price must fit the service, and that fairness depended entirely on a fair measure. Hammurabi's stone pillars declared that the king's guarantee extended beyond weight and volume. It guaranteed the equity of every transaction. Standardization became synonymous with royal justice, a tangible way the king's power reached into the marketplace and the home, promising order and reducing the fertile ground for grievance. The code was a monumental act of statecraft, proving that to rule a diverse empire, you first had to provide a common ruler. Hammurabi's laws carved justice in stone, but a greater challenge lay over the horizon, the challenge of distance itself. The empires that followed, like the Assyrians, stretched their reach across hundreds of miles, but it was the Achaemenid Persians who faced a problem of a different magnitude entirely. By 500 BC, their empire was the largest the world had ever seen, a colossal mosaic of peoples and landscapes stretching from the Indus River to the Aegean Sea. To govern such a realm, a king in Persepolis needed more than just standardized bricks or fair market weights. He needed a way to make the vast, empty spaces between his cities speak a common language. The genius of Persian administration was to build an entire nervous system for the empire, and its fundamental unit was a new standard of distance, the parasang. Traditionally, a parasang was the distance a man could walk in 1 hour, but that was far too vague for imperial logistics. The Persians standardized it, defining the parasang as a precise unit, roughly equivalent to 3.5 modern miles. This was not an abstract measurement. It was the literal building block of their most famous innovation, the royal road. This was not a single path, but a coordinated network of highways spanning over 1,600 miles, from the capital at Susa to the vital port of Sardis near the Aegean coast. At every parasang along the way, the state established way stations, stocked with fresh horses and supplies. A royal messenger, carrying the king's decrees, could travel this entire staggering distance in just 7 days by changing horses at each station. His speed was possible only because the entire system was planned and timed using the standardized parasang. Administrators knew exactly how far a horse could travel before tiring, how many stations were needed, and how long a journey should take. Distance, the ancient enemy of empire, had been tamed and translated into a schedule. The parasang transformed the sprawling, silent geography of the empire into a knowable, manageable grid, where time and space were finally in sync under one ruler's command. This logistical mastery served one supreme purpose: the reliable flow of imperial wealth. An empire of that scale could not survive on loyalty alone. It required a constant, predictable stream of revenue to pay its armies, maintain its roads, and project its power. The Persian taxation system, recorded in meticulous detail by historians like Herodotus, was a masterpiece of bureaucratic measurement. The empire was divided into 20 vast provinces, or satrapies. Each satrapy was not asked for a vague tribute of goods, but for a specific, calculated weight of silver measured in talents. The assessment was breathtakingly precise. Egypt, for instance, was required to pay 700 talents of silver per year, plus the proceeds from the fisheries of Lake Moeris. Babylon and Assyria together owed 1,000 talents. The key was the word talent. This was not a suggestion or an estimate. It was a demand for a specific mass of precious metal, a weight that had been standardized across the entire empire. Provincial governors collected taxes in local currencies and goods, but they were required to convert it all into pure silver bullion, which was then weighed on certified scales against the official royal weight set. Only when the scale balanced at the exact number of talents did the obligation to the King of Kings was considered fulfilled. This system turned the chaotic diversity of the empire's economies into a single, unified stream of value. A talent of silver from India was identical to a talent of silver from Ionia. This allowed the central treasury to budget, plan, and allocate resources on an imperial scale with a clarity never before possible. The measured talent of silver became the literal bloodstream of the empire, a life-giving flow of quantified value that pulsed along the royal road from every province back to the heart of power. It demonstrated that the true measure of an empire's strength was not just the territory on a map, but its ability to weigh that territory consistently and without dispute, and convert it into the cold, hard certainty of silver. Yet this imperial system of fixed weights and royal roads was built on a foundation of authority, not inquiry. It declared the standard because the king willed it. A profound intellectual shift was brewing in the scattered city-states across the Aegean Sea, where a new kind of mind began to ask a dangerous question. What if measurement was not a decree from a throne, but a truth written into the fabric of the universe itself? The Greek philosophers embarked on a radical experiment to rationalize measure. They sought to liberate it from the body of a king and anchor it in the immutable laws of mathematics and nature. Pythagoras and his followers became obsessed with this idea. For them, number was the essence of all reality. they famously discovered that the harmony of a plucked lyre string was not a mystery, but a measurable ratio. A string half the length produced a note exactly 1 octave higher. Here was a standard of perfection not stamped by a pharaoh, but revealed by geometry and sound. This was measurement as divine revelation of a different sort, a cosmic order accessible to human reason. They believed the same mathematical ratios that governed musical harmony must also govern the ideal forms of architecture, sculpture, and even the cosmos. The Greek pursuit of perfect proportion, from the columns of the Parthenon to the sculptures of the human form, was an attempt to build this discovered truth into their world. It was a move from imposed standardization to discovered standardization, from the king's arm to the harmony of the spheres. This philosophical quest for a natural standard, however, ran headlong into the messy reality of daily commerce. While philosophers dreamed of perfect ratios, the merchants in the Athenian agora or the Corinthian port needed to trade olive oil for Egyptian grain today. The practical measures they used, like the stade for distance or the mina for weight, were every bit as local and contentious as those in the ancient Near East. A stade was originally the length of a stadium's running track, but every city built its stadium to a different size. The mina was a weight, but its value in Athens differed from its value in Sparta or Thebes. The Greek world was a constellation of fiercely independent city-states, each with its own pride, its own gods, and its own standards. This created a fascinating tension. On one hand, you had this soaring intellectual vision of a universal, mathematical order. On the other, you had a patchwork of competing local measures that fueled both trade and constant dispute. A ship captain sailing from Athens to Rhodes had to carry conversion tables, not just for currency, but for weights and volumes, knowing the same amphora of wine would be measured differently upon arrival. The solution was not imperial decree, but negotiation and convention. Trading leagues and treaties between cities often included clauses that specified which city's standard would be used for a particular transaction, or established agreed-upon conversion rates. The measure became a tool of diplomacy. This system was fluid, often frustrating, but it was also adaptable. It reflected a world where authority was fragmented, where truth was debated in the marketplace as well as the academy. The Greek experiment thus left a dual legacy, the glorious, abstract ideal of a measure derived from nature's own logic, and the pragmatic, contested reality of measures as instruments of deal-making between free agents. They gifted the future not with a single unified system, but with the powerful idea that measurement could be a subject of reason, not just a command of power. The Greek dream of a rational measure was a philosopher's vision, but it took the relentless pragmatism of Rome to forge that idea into the steel of an empire. Where others debated standards, the Romans engineered them, creating a system of measurement so brutally effective it became the operating code for the largest, most enduring state the ancient world had ever known. This was not about cosmic harmony, it was about control on a scale that demanded a new language of precision. The Roman system was a perfect fusion of military necessity and imperial ambition, where every unit was a tool for conquest and administration. At its heart was the pes, the Roman foot, but this was no body part of a king. It was a standardized, reproducible length, meticulously defined and cast in bronze as an official reference. This pes was then multiplied into the empire's most famous unit of distance, the mille passus, or 1,000 paces. A Roman military pace was 2 steps, left foot to left foot, measured as 5 Roman feet. So a mille passus, our mile, was 5,000 Roman feet. This was a unit born from the legionaries' march. Surveyors marching ahead of the army would literally count their steps to measure out the perfect rectangular grid for a new military camp, a fortress, or even an entire colonial city. The mile became the literal measure of Roman expansion, a chain of standardized steps stretching from the deserts of Syria to the mists of Britannia. This geometrical precision was mirrored in the measures that fed the machine. The empire ran on grain, and to manage the distribution that kept 1 million people in Rome from discontent, the state relied on 2 perfectly standardized containers. For dry goods like wheat, barley, and lentils, there was the Modius, a specific cylindrical vessel. For liquids, primarily wine and olive oil, there was the Amphora, a tall ceramic jar with a defined capacity. The genius was in their integration into a vast logistical web. A provincial governor in Egypt knew exactly how many modii of wheat his province owed as tax, because the measure was the same in Alexandria as it was in the port of Ostia outside Rome. Ships were built with holds calculated to hold a certain number of amphorae, allowing planners to know precisely how many vessels were needed for the annual grain fleet from North Africa. When that grain arrived in Rome, it was stored in the massive horia, the public warehouses, and then distributed to citizens as a monthly dole. The clerk handing out the ration used an official Modius measure, guaranteeing every citizen received an equal share, a direct and tangible benefit of Roman order that bought social peace. For the legions stationed on distant frontiers, this system was a lifeline. A quartermaster could calculate the exact supply needs for a legion of 5,000 men for a month, order that amount in standardized modii and amphorae from the nearest province, and have it delivered along roads measured in miles, knowing the quantities would be correct upon arrival. Measurement became the silent, non-commissioned officer of the Roman world, the indispensable tool that allowed a central authority to project power, feed populations, and maintain cohesion across thousands of miles and hundreds of cultures. The Roman foot and the Roman Modius did more than build aqueducts and fill granaries. They built the very idea of a unified, manageable world state, proving that precision in measurement was the ultimate expression of power. A merchant in the bustling port of Londinium could now draft a contract with a supplier in Alexandria, and both men understood the terms with perfect clarity. The Roman system of measurement did more than build roads and feed legions. It built a common commercial language that unified the entire Mediterranean basin into a single, functioning economic organism. For the first time in the West, a shared set of standards, enforced by the relentless machinery of the Roman army and bureaucracy, allowed capital and goods to flow with a freedom and security never before possible. The key to this economic unification was the seamless marriage of 2 things, a stable currency and reliable measures. The Roman sestertius was more than a coin. It was a fixed unit of account, a promise stamped in bronze or silver that held its value from one end of the empire to the other. And that value was always expressed in terms of the standard measures everyone used. A contract might stipulate the delivery of 500 modii of Egyptian wheat to Ostia, to be paid at a rate of 3 sestertii per modius upon verified delivery. The beauty of this system was its utter predictability. The Modius measure used by the dockworkers in Alexandria to load the grain was an exact replica of the one used by the port authorities in Ostia to check it. There was no argument over quantity. The payment in sestertii was equally unambiguous, its metal content and weight guaranteed by the Imperial mint. This eliminated the immense hidden costs that had plagued ancient trade, the cost of haggling over definitions, the cost of hiring local mediators to verify measures, the cost of losses from accidental or deliberate miscalculation. By reducing this friction to almost nothing, Rome dramatically lowered the transaction costs of doing business across vast distances. A merchant could now calculate his potential profit or loss before the ship even left port, because the variables of measure and money were constants. This economic predictability bound the provinces to Rome with chains of gold and grain, far more effectively than legions alone ever could. Provinces began to specialize not in what they could consume locally, but in what they could produce most efficiently for the entire empire. North Africa became the breadbasket, Spain supplied olive oil and precious metals, Gaul produced textiles and pottery. This was not a collection of isolated economies, but an integrated network where each region's prosperity was tied to its place in the Roman whole. The standardization of measure and money created the first truly globalized economy in the Western world. A vast, interdependent market where a vineyard owner in Campania could prosper because his wine, measured in standard amphorae, was prized by consumers in Germania who paid for it with standardized coin. It was a quiet, bureaucratic miracle that made the Roman Empire not just a political entity, but an inescapable economic reality for everyone who lived within its measured world. Yet for all its power, the Roman system was a world unto itself. Beyond its frontiers, a different kind of network was weaving together civilizations Rome could scarcely imagine, a highway not of stone but of trust. The Silk Road was a phantom empire of commerce, spanning thousands of miles across deserts and mountain passes where no single emperor's law could reach. Here, there were no imperial inspectors to verify a cubit rod, no central mint to guarantee a coin's purity. The glue that held this vast, decentralized exchange together was an invisible currency more reliable than any stamped denarius, the universally trusted standard of weight. While measures for length and volume hopelessly fragmented from one oasis to the next, the language of mass became the essential translator. A Chinese merchant from Chang'an and a Sogdian caravan master meeting in the markets of Samarkand did not share a faith, a tongue, or a ruler, but they did share a profound, mutual understanding of a balanced scale. The unit that often sat in the pan was the liang, or tael, a precise measure of mass that became the silent arbiter of value across Asia. Silk, that miraculous, lightweight treasure, was not sold by the bolt's length, which could be stretched or mismeasured. It was sold by weight. A bundle of silk threads would be carefully placed on one side of a scale, and on the other, the merchant would add finely carved stone weights representing liang. This process created a moment of pure, empirical truth that transcended language. Both parties could watch the beam settle, agreeing on a physical fact, not a cultural opinion. The same principle applied to the silver that flowed east to pay for these luxuries. Roman silver coins, Persian drachms, and later, Arab dirhams were often valued not by their face, but by their weight in precious metal. They would be piled onto a scale and weighed against the local standard liang to determine their true worth in that market. This practice created a de facto global system. A stash of silver coins melted down in Constantinople could be recast into bars in Baghdad, and those bars would still hold their value in cotton or loy, and because their mass was constant and verifiable. The humble balance scale carried in every merchant's pack became the portable court of law for the Silk Road. Its fairness depended on the integrity of those weights, and so the most trusted weights themselves became objects of art and assurance, often inscribed with symbols of good fortune or stamped with the mark of a renowned trading house. To use a false weight was to break the single thread of trust upon which the entire, fragile web of transcontinental trade depended. This cross-cultural consensus on mass was the non-negotiable prerequisite for the exchange of luxuries. It meant a Persian trader could confidently send a caravan eastward carrying glassware and wool, knowing that the weight of silver he received in return could be precisely measured and trusted, even if he couldn't read the Chinese characters on the merchant's seal. The Silk Road did not run on silk or silver. It ran on the quiet, mutual faith in a balanced scale, proving that before goods could travel the world, agreement on how to weigh them had to journey even farther. But this elegant system of trust had a shadow, a constant and corrosive countercurrent of human cunning. For every official standard cast in bronze, there was a mind at work trying to bend it. The promise of consistent measure created its own dark industry, the business of fraud. A standardized silver coin was a marvel of commerce, but its very uniformity presented a tempting opportunity. Unscrupulous individuals would shave tiny slivers of precious metal from the edges of many coins, collecting the valuable filings to sell while still passing the now underweight coin at its full face value. This practice, called clipping, slowly bled the integrity from the monetary system, leaving honest citizens with coins that were literally worth less than they appeared. Similarly, the official Modius grain measure, so crucial to fair distribution, could be subtly sabotaged. A dishonest merchant might install a false bottom in the vessel, creating a hidden cavity that made it appear full while actually delivering less grain. The most direct assault, however, was on the balance scale itself, the very symbol of impartial truth. A merchant could tilt the playing field by using a beam with arms of uneven length, or by employing one set of heavy weights to take in precious metal and a lighter, fraudulent set to pay it out. These were not victimless crimes. In an empire where a family's monthly grain dole was a matter of survival, a short measure meant hunger. When a soldier's pay in silver coin was clipped, it eroded his faith in the very state he defended. Fraud at this scale was a direct attack on the social contract, unraveling the hard-won trust that made complex societies possible. It turned the marketplace from a place of secure exchange back into a jungle of suspicion. Empires understood that this was not petty theft, it was treason against the system of order itself, and they responded with draconian force. The penalties for tampering with weights and measures were famously severe. In Babylon, Hammurabi's code prescribed harsh physical punishments for merchants using false measures. In Rome, laws decreed that a convicted fraudster could be exiled or sentenced to forced labor in the mines. But punishment after the fact was not enough. Prevention was key, and this led to one of the most public rituals of imperial authority, the marketplace inspection. State officials, often accompanied by temple priests or soldiers, would make regular, unannounced visits to the agora or forum. They carried with them the master standards, the perfect bronze weights, and the true cubit rods issued from the capital. Every merchant's scale would be tested, their weights placed on the official balance against the state's own. Every measuring vessel was filled with water or grain, and then poured into the certified standard to check its volume. This was justice performed in the open air, a theater of fairness where the power of the king was demonstrated not through conquest but through calibration. A merchant whose tools passed inspection might receive a seal of approval, a mark of honor that attracted customers. One whose scale was found to be rigged faced immediate public disgrace and punishment. This constant, visible enforcement served a dual purpose. It rooted out corruption, but more importantly, it reassured the public. It made the abstract guarantee of the king tangible. A citizen watching the inspector carefully balance the weights could see with their own eyes that the system was being guarded. The battle for standardization was never a single victory. It was a daily, grinding campaign against the entropy of deceit, a reminder that the authority to measure was meaningless without the relentless will to defend its truth. The relentless defense of these standards did more than just prevent fraud. It created a fertile ground for a new kind of thought. The practical need to measure land, grain, and goods with absolute consistency gave rise to the world's first true mathematical problems, transforming simple counting into a sophisticated science. This was a symbiotic evolution where the demands of the tax collector's ledger directly shaped the abstractions of the scholar's clay tablet. Consider the annual flooding of the Nile, a life-giving event that was also a bureaucratic nightmare. When the river receded, it deposited a fresh layer of silt and completely erased the property boundaries of thousands of farms. The pharaoh's surveyors, armed with their knotted ropes standardized to the royal cubit, had to walk these muddy fields and calculate their area anew for taxation. How do you calculate the area of an irregular, four-sided plot of land? You cannot simply multiply length by width if the sides are uneven. This relentless, real-world challenge forced the development of early geometry. Egyptian scribes devised formulas to break complex shapes into simpler triangles and rectangles, calculating areas with remarkable accuracy. Their mathematics was not a philosophical pursuit, it was a direct tool of state administration, born from the need to measure the earth for the purpose of taxing it. The units of measure themselves were designed with calculation in mind. Two great numerical systems emerged to make this daily arithmetic easier: the decimal-base 10 system favored by Egypt and the sexagesimal-base 60 system pioneered in Mesopotamia. The choice was profoundly practical. The decimal system, using our 10 fingers, was intuitive for counting, but the Mesopotamians saw a greater advantage in the number 60. It is a beautifully divisible number, cleanly split by 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 10, 12, 15, 20, and 30. This made trade and distribution incredibly efficient. If you had a talent of silver, a large unit, and needed to pay 6 workers, dividing it into 60 smaller shekels meant each worker got 10 shekels with no messy fractions. This sexagesimal logic is why we still have 60 minutes in an hour and 360 degrees in a circle, a legacy of ancient accountants striving for clean divisions of weight, time, and space. Standardized measurement provided the concrete, repeatable experiments that abstract mathematics required. You cannot develop a reliable formula for the volume of a cylindrical grain silo unless every silo builder is using the same definition of a cubit for its height and diameter. The consistency of the physical standard allowed mathematicians to observe patterns and derive universal rules. Babylonian clay tablets are filled with such exercises, essentially standardized test problems for scribes. One might read, a trench is 500 cubits long, 10 cubits wide, and 1 cubit deep. How many workers are needed to dig it if each can move 10 cubic cubits of earth per day? The problem only makes sense if everyone agrees on the length of a cubit and the meaning of a cubic cubit. In this way, the royal cubit rod was more than a tool for builders, it was a prerequisite for theorists. It turned the chaotic physical world into a realm of predictable, quantifiable relationships, inviting the human mind to discover the equations hidden within. The tax assessor measuring a field and the philosopher contemplating the nature of space were, in the end, using two sides of the same ruler. This mathematical precision found its ultimate expression not on a clay tablet, but in the soaring architecture of the state granary. Once a kingdom could accurately measure its grain, it faced a new challenge: where to put it all. The solution was a storage revolution, a wave of monumental engineering designed not for gods or kings, but for the humble kernel of wheat. From the banks of the Tiber to the Yellow River, empires began to construct vast warehouses, their very blueprints dictated by the standardized units of volume they were meant to hold. In Rome, these were the horia, immense brick and concrete structures that lined the riverfront at Ostia and dotted the city. Their design was a masterpiece of logistical planning. The internal space was divided into rows of individual storage rooms, each calculated to hold a specific number of Modius measures. The walls were raised on pillars to allow air to circulate, preventing rot, and the floors were layered with crushed pottery to keep out moisture and rodents. A manager could walk the aisles, consult his ledger, and know with absolute certainty that cell number 12 contained exactly 5,000 modii of Sicilian wheat, ready for the monthly public dole. This was measurement made physical, a three-dimensional grid of abundance that turned food from a seasonal uncertainty into a quantifiable, controllable resource. Across the world, a parallel innovation was taking shape in Han Dynasty China, known as the ever-normal granary system. The philosophy was one of profound stability. In years of plentiful harvest, the state would purchase surplus grain from farmers using a standardized measure called the hu. This grain was then stored in a network of massive, strategically located granaries. Then, during lean years or when local prices soared, the government would release this stored grain back onto the market at a fair price. the entire system's viability depended on the unchanging definition of the who. Officials collecting the grain, accountants recording the inventory, and distributors selling it all had to be using the exact same volume. Without that consistency, the system would collapse into corruption and mistrust. The ever-normal granary was more than a food bank. It was a tool of economic and social control, a tangible demonstration that the emperor's care for his people was measured out in precise, dependable portions. It prevented famine, yes, but it also prevented the social unrest that hunger inevitably bred. These granaries were the ultimate symbols of state power, but of a very particular kind. A pyramid proclaimed a pharaoh's divinity, a colosseum displayed Rome's might for entertainment, but a granary projected power through security. Its looming, utilitarian walls communicated a simple, potent message. We have measured what we have, we know exactly how much there is, and we have the means to protect it and distribute it as we see fit. Control of the standard measure was the key that unlocked the granary door. It allowed a central authority to calculate the empire's total wealth in grain, to plan for armies and droughts years in advance, and to demonstrate its benevolence through orderly, measured distribution. The citizen receiving his monthly grain ration from an official Modius was participating in a ritual of trust, a direct transaction with the state that reinforced its role as the guarantor of order and survival. In the silent, cool darkness of these vast storehouses, filled to the rafters with geometrically arranged bounty, the abstract concept of standardized volume became the very foundation of imperial resilience and control. The true measure of an empire's strength was not just the gold in its treasury, but the calculated, knowable abundance within its walls. The granary's walls held a kingdom's wealth, but its true power lay in knowing exactly where that kingdom was. To administer an empire, you first had to draw its borders, and to draw a border, you needed to measure the empty earth itself. This challenge moved measurement from the marketplace into the wilderness, transforming it from a tool of commerce into the very science of space. The Romans, masters of order, elevated this to a profession, the agrimensors or land surveyors. These were not mere clerks with ropes, they were the empire's frontline engineers of control, armed with a deceptively simple instrument called the Groma. This device was a cross of wood mounted on a staff with plumb bobs hanging from each of its four arms. By sighting along the lines created by the weighted cords, a surveyor could establish perfectly straight lines and right angles across any landscape. His work was guided by the unyielding standard of the Roman foot and the mile. Using chains of a precise, known length, his team would pace out the land, converting forests, hills, and rivers into a geometrical grid of calculable property. Every new military camp, every colonial town like Londinium or Carthago Nova, was laid out as a perfect rectangle of streets, its dimensions recorded in the immutable language of Roman measure. The surveyor's map, drawn on parchment or etched into bronze, was a legal document, a promise from the state that your plot of land was exactly 500 feet by 750 feet, because it had been measured against the same standard used in Rome itself. This act of measuring the earth did more than settle disputes. It imposed a conceptual order on chaos, turning the wild, unknown territory into a knowable, taxable, and governable asset. The straight road ahead was not just a path, it was a measured line of authority stamped across the continent. Yet for all its precision, this was still a local geometry, a mapping of the empire's body without knowing the true scale of the world it inhabited. That leap of understanding required a mind willing to use a local standard to measure the planet. In the great library of Alexandria, the Greek scholar Eratosthenes made this breathtaking conceptual jump. He learned that in the town of Syene, due south of Alexandria, the sun shone directly down a deep well at noon on the summer solstice, meaning it was exactly overhead. In Alexandria, at that same moment, a vertical pillar cast a shadow. Eratosthenes measured the angle of that shadow. He reasoned that this angle represented the curvature of the earth between the two cities. Now came the crucial part. He needed the distance between Syene and Alexandria. This is where standardization became the key to cosmic truth. The distance was known from caravan travel logs to be about 5,000 stades. But a stade was a notoriously variable local measure. Eratosthenes, however, relied on the standardized stade used in the royal Egyptian surveys, a length that was consistent and officially recognized. Using geometry and that one trusted standard of distance, he calculated the Earth's circumference to be about 252,000 stades. Converted to modern units, his estimate was within a few percent of the actual figure. This was a monumental moment, a unit of measure created to pace out a racetrack or tax a farmer's field had just been used to encircle the globe. Eratosthenes had proven that the same mathematics that governed a grain measure could govern the planet, that a human-devised standard could unveil a universal truth. Measurement was no longer just for kings and merchants, it was for philosophers and explorers. The local stade had become a cosmic ruler, and the map of the world could finally begin to be drawn to scale, not by guesswork but by calculation. The known world was shrinking, not in size but in mystery, because it could finally be measured. The measured mile and the calculated talent of silver were the arteries of empire, but its fist was forged in the armory. For a state to project power, it needed more than efficient tax collection. It needed weapons, and in overwhelming numbers. The leap from crafting individual swords for heroes to equipping legions of tens of thousands was impossible without the silent discipline of the standard measure. This was the birth of the military-industrial complex, where measurement became the ultimate force multiplier, transforming warfare from a contest of champions into a machine of mass production. Consider the humble arrow, a weapon that defined battles from the plains of Assyria to the fields of Agincourt. For an archer, each arrow is a single-use item, loosed into the air and often lost. An army on campaign might expend tens of thousands in a single engagement. Handcrafting each shaft to a unique length and weight would be a logistical nightmare, resulting in wild inaccuracy when fired from formation. The solution was a simple, brutal standard. Armies decreed a uniform length for arrow shafts, a specific diameter, and a regulated weight for the arrowhead. This allowed workshops, often state-controlled, to operate like primitive factories. One craftsman could specialize in cutting shafts to the official length, another in forging identical iron heads to the standard weight, and a third in fletching with feathers of a prescribed size. These components were then assembled by less skilled workers because every part was designed to fit with every other. A soldier could pick any arrow from the supply cart and know it would fly true from his bow, a bow that was itself likely built to a standardized draw length. This principle of interchangeability, born from measurement, extended to every piece of a soldier's kit. The Roman legionary's rectangular shield, the scutum, was not a unique artifact. It was a manufactured product with specified dimensions, curvature, and thickness. Its wooden planks, metal boss, and leather edging were all made to fit a template. When a shield was damaged in battle, its parts could be salvaged and used to repair another, or it could be quickly replaced from a stockpile of identical units. This meant a legion could maintain its fighting strength far from home because its equipment was modular and repairable, all thanks to the initial decision to define a shield's measurements. The Roman military understood this so deeply that they established permanent arms factories called fabrici across the empire. These were not blacksmith forges, but organized industrial centers where workflows were dictated by standard measures. In a fabrica, the process of making a sword, from the length of the blade blank to the weight of the pommel, was broken down into sequential steps, each checked against official gauges. This division of labor, guided by measurement, allowed for astonishing output. A single fabricator could produce enough armor, swords, and spears to equip multiple new legions every year, turning raw ore from Iberian mines into standardized instruments of conquest with relentless efficiency. The state that mastered this process did not just have an army, it had a renewable resource of military power. But perhaps no ancient technology better illustrates this principle than the Athenian trireme, the sleek, fast warship that secured Greek naval dominance. Building a trireme was an exercise in precision engineering on a colossal scale. A single ship required over 170 rowers seated in 3 staggered levels, a hull designed for speed, and a bronze ram at the prow. To build a fleet of hundreds, as Athens did, required shipyards to operate with the coordination of a beehive. This was only possible because every measurement was standardized. The thickness of the hull planks, the length of the oars, the precise angles of the rowing ports, and the dimensions of the mortise and tenon joints that held the ship together were all dictated by official specifications. These specs allowed for prefabrication. Teams of carpenters could be making identical planks in separate workshops, knowing they would all fit together when brought to the dry dock. Oar makers could produce hundreds of oars to the same length and balance, interchangeable between any ship in the fleet. This system meant a trireme could be built in a matter of weeks, and more importantly, repaired just as quickly after battle. A damaged ship could be pulled into dock, its broken planks removed and replaced with standard spares from the yard's inventory, and returned to sea with minimal delay. The Athenian Navy's strength was not merely in the courage of its crews, but in the measurable, reproducible design of its ships. Standardization turned naval warfare into a numbers game the state could calculate and win. It meant that the true weapon was not the trireme itself, but the shipyard's template, the official measure that allowed one to become 100. In this way, the ruler and the scale became more decisive than the sword or the ram, for they were the tools that built the machine of war itself. The armory's standard measures built machines of war, but they were forged in a place of profound peace. Long before kings minted coins or surveyors paced out borders, the ultimate guarantor of the standard was not the palace but the temple. This was the sacred origin of measurement, where the divine and the decimal met. In the ancient world, the temple was far more than a place of worship. It was the community's central bank, its archive, and its bureau of standards, all wrapped in an aura of unquestionable sanctity. The gods themselves were believed to be the first architects, and so the measures used to build their houses were considered holy, direct revelations from a higher order. The royal cubit was not just a pharaoh's decree, it was a gift from Thoth, the god of wisdom and measurement. The shekel weight was sanctioned by Shamash, the Mesopotamian god of justice and truth. By anchoring these standards in the divine, they were lifted above human dispute. Who would dare cheat using a weight blessed by the sun god? This spiritual authority became the invisible foundation of the entire economy. Temples operated as the beating heart of a sacred economic system. Farmers brought their first and finest harvest as a tithe, measured out in the temple's official vessels. Herders donated livestock, artisans offered crafted goods. All of this wealth flowed into the temple storerooms, not as chaotic plunder, but as meticulously recorded tribute, entered on clay tablets using the temple's standard units. This created a vast reservoir of material wealth under divine protection. From this reservoir, the temple could redistribute food during famines, pay workers for community projects, and fund the artisans who built and adorned the sacred precincts. The temple, in essence, became the original central bank, and its standard measures were the only currency that mattered within its ledgers. The construction of the temple itself was the ultimate act of sacred measurement. Every brick in the ziggurat of Ur or the temple of Karnak was laid according to a divine blueprint, its dimensions calculated in holy cubits. the architect was not just a builder but a priest, translating celestial proportions into stone. This process sanctified the very act of measurement, making the cubit rod a ritual object as much as a tool. This fusion of spiritual and temporal power was a masterstroke of social control. When a king declared that his weights were true because they matched those kept in the temple, he was borrowing the god's own authority. Tax collection was no longer mere extraction. It was a sacred duty, a returning of a portion to the divine stewards who ensured the Nile would flood or the rains would come. A merchant using stamped temple weights was participating in a moral economy where honest dealing was a form of piety. This moral authority was the glue that held early empires together. It transformed the cold, bureaucratic necessity of standardization into a cosmic principle. The straight line of the surveyor, the balanced scale of the merchant, the even brick of the builder, all echoed the harmony of the heavens. To defy the standard was not just to cheat your neighbor, it was to offend the gods and unravel the order of the world itself. The temple's silent vaults, where master cubits and perfect weights rested in the gloom, were more than storehouses. They were the spiritual power plants of civilization, generating the trust that made everything from daily trade to monumental empire possible. But the temple's divine guarantee, like the empire it supported, was not eternal. The fall of Rome was not merely a political event, it was a great forgetting, a slow unraveling of the very fabric of measured order. As the legions withdrew and the imperial bureaucracy crumbled, the light of that common standard flickered and died across Western Europe. The universal language of the Roman foot and the Modius fractured into 1,000 local dialects. In the absence of a central authority to enforce them, the master standards locked away in forgotten fabrici and granaries became mere curiosities. What rushed in to fill the vacuum was a regression to a world of hyper-local truth. A foot was once again the length of the local lord's boot. A bushel was the size of the basket used in the nearest monastery's fields. The mile, that perfect measure of the legionary's pace, dissolved into vague descriptions like a day's walk or the distance a man can hear a church bell. This was not just a change in tools, it was a collapse of a shared reality. The economic and administrative unity that had defined the Roman world shattered. Long-distance trade, which had flowed along measured roads with trusted weights, withered. Why would a merchant risk a caravan from Flanders to Italy if the measure for his wool in every tiny lordship along the way was different, and each local bailiff could arbitrarily declare his own measure as the true one? The risk of dispute and loss became too great. Commerce retreated to a local scale, to what could be bartered in the shadow of the castle keep using measures everyone in that village personally knew. This fragmentation of measure was both a symptom and a cause of the broader economic breakdown. Without a common unit to calculate value, taxation became arbitrary and oppressive. A peasant might owe his lord 10 bushels of grain, but if the lord could increase the size of his official bushel each year, the peasant's obligation grew silently, with no recourse to a higher, fairer standard. Complex projects became nearly impossible. The coordinated effort needed to maintain Roman aqueducts or roads required precise measurement and planning, a language no one spoke universally anymore. Society relocalized, turning inward because the mechanisms for external connection, built on trust and standardization, had been lost. The early Middle Ages were not dark because people forgot how to think, but because they forgot how to measure together. The dependency of a complex economy on shared standards was laid brutally bare. The world grew smaller, quieter, and more isolated, not for lack of ideas, but for lack of a common ruler. Out of this fractured silence, a new king heard a powerful echo from the past. Centuries after Rome's fall, Charlemagne gazed upon his sprawling Frankish empire, a patchwork of tribes and traditions, and saw the same old problem. His realm stretched from modern France deep into Germany and Italy. Yet a merchant from Paris might use a different pound of silver than a trader in Aachen, sowing confusion and limiting his royal authority. Charlemagne envisioned a new Roman peace, a Pax Carolingiana, and he understood that such unity could not be built on a foundation of mismatched measures. His ambitious solution was a renaissance of order, a deliberate project to reimpose the lost language of standardization across Western Europe. At the heart of this project were two key units he sought to define for all his subjects. For weight, he promoted the livre or pound, a unit of silver crucial for trade and taxation. For length, particularly for the cloth that was a staple of medieval commerce, he championed the aune or ell, roughly the length from a man's elbow to his fingertips, a direct descendant of the ancient cubit. Charlemagne did not simply declare these units, he attempted to physically distribute the standards. He ordered the creation of master weights and measuring rods, copies of which were to be sent to bishops and counts throughout the empire, instructing them to enforce these measures in their local markets and courts. This was a profound political insight. Charlemagne recognized that to unite people under one crown and one Christian faith, he first had to unite them under one pound and one ell. He was trying to rebuild the invisible infrastructure of trust that had once made vast administration possible. The ambition was breathtaking, but the reality of the early medieval world proved stubborn. Without the dense Roman bureaucracy or road network to enforce them, and with local lords fiercely protective of their own customs, Charlemagne's standards never achieved perfect uniformity. A pound in one city might still differ slightly from a pound in another 100 miles away. Yet, even in its imperfection, the Carolingian reform was a beacon. It sent a clear message to every subsequent medieval king that political power was inextricably linked to metrological control. The attempt itself became a powerful lesson, written into the administrative memory of Europe, waiting for a time when stronger states could try again. Charlemagne's dream of a single standard flickered, but trade could not wait for kings to agree. Across the fragmented landscape of medieval Europe, a different kind of order was stitching itself together, not from the top down, but from the ground up, through the sheer force of commercial necessity. The great international fairs, like those in the Champagne region of France, became the neutral ground where this new order was forged. For a few weeks each year, these fields transformed into bustling cosmopolitan cities where Flemish wool merchants, Italian silk traders, and German metalworkers all converged. Here, no emperor's law ruled, only the law of the deal, and the first obstacle to any deal was the cacophony of measures. A merchant from Genoa arrived with his local braccio for measuring cloth, while a buyer from Bruges used his own Flemish ell. To do business, they needed a translator. This translator was not a person, but a book, the conversion table. Market authorities, often the counts who sponsored the fair, would publish and enforce official lists. These tables might state that one Genos braccio equaled 2.5 Flemish ells, or that the Cologne mark of silver was worth 32 English pennies. These were not abstract calculations, they were the essential rules of the game, posted publicly and backed by the fair's own courts. A dispute over measure could be settled on the spot by appealing to the official table, a temporary but powerful standard that allowed strangers to trust each other just long enough to exchange their goods. Beyond the conversion table, traders developed another clever workaround, the trusted commodity bundle. Instead of arguing over the precise weight of raw wool, which could be damp or tangled, they traded in standardized sacks. A sack of wool became a unit of account in itself, its quality and approximate weight guaranteed by the reputation of the region it came from, like the famous wool of England's Cotswolds. Similarly, a ton of wine was a large barrel of a generally accepted size. You weren't buying a precise volume of liquid, you were buying 1 ton from Bordeaux. This bundled approach shifted trust from the exactness of a measure to the consistency of a package and the reputation of its origin. It was a pragmatic fudge, allowing commerce to flow despite the underlying chaos of local standards. But who would ensure these sacks were honest or that merchants obeyed the fair's conversion rules? This was the role of the merchant guilds. These were not casual clubs, but powerful fraternities that governed their members with strict codes. A guild of Hanseatic traders from the Baltic or of Venetian spice merchants would establish their own internal standards for weighing goods and assessing quality. To be a member in good standing meant you used the guild's certified weights and measures when dealing with your brethren. A merchant caught using false measures would face heavy fines or, worse, expulsion from the guild, which meant losing access to its network of trusted partners, credit, and legal protection. The guild hall, with its master weights under lock and key, became a mini temple of commerce, creating islands of metrological trust in a sea of inconsistency. These three tools, the fair's conversion table, the commodity bundle, and the guild's private standard, formed the medieval merchant's essential toolkit. They reveal a profound truth. In the absence of a unifying empire, the human drive to trade, to connect, and to build trust simply found another way. It built a decentralized, negotiated, and endlessly adaptable system of agreement, proving that the need for a common measure is so fundamental to society that if a single standard cannot be imposed, 100 temporary ones will be invented in its place. Yet even the negotiated peace of the marketplace could not satisfy the demands of a growing kingdom. The barons of England, gathered at Runny, met in the year 1215, were not philosophers dreaming of universal harmony. They were practical men driven to rebellion by a more immediate grievance, the financial chaos of a crown that could not measure its own demands. Their great charter, the Magna Carta, is remembered for its principles of justice, but buried within its clauses is a quiet revolution in metrology. Clause 35 made a simple, sweeping demand. It shall be the measure of wine, of ale, and of corn, the London quarter, throughout our whole realm. And so it shall be for weights as it is for measures. This was not a plea for fairness from the common people, but a calculated move by the nobility to protect their own wealth. They were tired of the king's agents arriving at their estates with arbitrary measures, demanding taxes in grain or assessing fines in wine using vessels that seemed to grow larger with every visit. A local lord might owe the crown 20 quarters of wheat, but if the king's quarter measure was secretly larger than the one used locally, the lord's obligation silently increased. This unpredictability made estate management impossible and fueled deep resentment. The barons were, in effect, demanding a standardized contract with the crown. They wanted to know the exact dimensions of their obligations, to lock the royal measure in place so it could not be quietly expanded. In this light, the Magna Carta's famous clause was a conservative act, a baronial insistence on predictable exaction rather than a democratic gift. Yet its consequences were profound. By demanding one measure for the entire realm, the clause planted a seed of national standardization that the crown itself would later nurture. It established the London quarter, the measure used in the kingdom's capital and largest market, as the official benchmark. This gave the monarchy a powerful tool it had not fully wielded since Charlemagne. Future kings seeking to centralize their own power would enforce this very standard, sending out royal inspectors to ensure that the measures in York and Bristol matched those in London. The crown, in enforcing the barons' demand for its own predictability, gradually assumed the role of the nation's chief metrologist. What began as a tool to limit royal power ironically became an instrument of royal authority, creating a unified economic space that strengthened the state. The shared gallon and the common bushel began to weave England together, thread by thread, long before a true nation-state existed. This legal demand for a single measure pointed toward a future where truth was not local but national, and where the king's guarantee was stamped not just on coins but on every pint and every pound across the land. The barons of Runnymede demanded a single national measure, but the scientists of the following centuries would ask for something far more ambitious. They sought a universal ruler, one not derived from the length of a king's arm or the customs of a market town, but from the immutable laws of nature itself. This was a philosophical rebellion against the entire history of measurement. For millennia, a standard was an act of authority, a declaration of power. The new thinkers of the scientific revolution saw this as arbitrary, a human invention prone to all the flaws and variations of humanity. They believed truth resided not in a royal decree, but in the cosmos, and they began a grand quest to find a unit of measure so perfect it would be invariable across all space and time. Their instruments were no longer balance scales and cubit rods, but telescopes, pendulums, and the precise angles of the stars. The great astronomer Galileo, watching a chandelier swing in a cathedral, realized something profound. The time of a pendulum swing depends not on how far it is pulled, but solely on the length of its string. Here was a potential new standard for time, a second defined by the mechanics of a swinging weight, a rhythm dictated by gravity itself. This idea that a fundamental constant of physics could become humanity's clock was revolutionary. It suggested that the universe held its own perfect measures, waiting to be discovered. But time was only one dimension. The greater prize was a new standard for length, a meter that belonged to no king. If the pendulum could define a second from gravity, could the Earth itself define a meter from its own geometry? This breathtaking idea took hold in the 18th century, particularly in France, where Enlightenment philosophers were dismantling the very idea of divinely ordained monarchy. They proposed a radical solution to derive the fundamental unit of length from the planet. The meter would be defined as 1/10,000,000th of the distance from the North Pole to the equator, measured along a meridian line passing through Paris. Think of the staggering ambition here. After thousands of years of measuring the world with human scale tools, humanity now proposed to measure itself against the world. This was not about convenience for tax collectors or cloth merchants. It was an attempt to anchor human affairs to a cosmic scale, to root law, commerce, and science in a democratic truth that no emperor could alter. The project to survey the meridian and cast the first platinum meter bar was one of the greatest scientific undertakings of its age, a concrete expression of the Enlightenment faith in reason. It represented the ultimate evolution of an ancient imperial need. Pharaohs had used the royal cubit, a piece of their own body, to impose order on their kingdom. Now, a new republic would use a fraction of the Earth's body to impose a new order of rationality on the world. The metric system, born from this philosophy, was framed as the final divorce of measurement from the whims of power. It promised a silent, perfect language for a new age of global science and perhaps global understanding. The platinum meter bar was a declaration of independence from the body of the king, yet the ghost of the emperor's foot still walks among us. You can hear its echo in the very words we use. The modern inch is a direct descendant of the Roman uncia, meaning 1/12, originally a 12th of the Roman pes or foot. When Roman surveyors and legionaries marched across Britannia, they brought their pes with them, and though the empire fell, the measure stubbornly persisted in the local soil. Over centuries, through the messy amalgamation of Saxon, Norse, and Norman influences, these units evolved, but their lineage remained unbroken. The English foot, standardized by statute in the 16th century, and its 12-inch division, are living fossils of Roman administration, a metrological thread stretching back 2,000 years. The imperial system of inches, feet, and miles is not a random collection, but a palimpsest of history, where each unit carries the faded imprint of a hand that once ruled the world. Its logic is not decimal, but deeply human and practical, born from the ease of dividing by halves, thirds, and fourths, a necessity for carpenters and merchants long before calculators. This system represents one answer to the ancient imperative, a standardized order that emerged from conquest and custom, then hardened into tradition. It is the heir of the royal Cubit, adapted and inherited rather than discovered. Meanwhile, the metric system pursued a different inheritance, that of the philosopher's dream. It rejected the anthropomorphic foot for the geographical meridian, seeking a standard not from tradition, but from nature's own geometry. Its decimal logic is the logic of the accountant and the scientist, designed for effortless scaling by tens, a clean break from the fractions of the workshop. Yet for all its revolutionary fervor, the meter was fulfilling the same timeless function as the pharaoh's cubit rod. Both were tools designed to impose a single, rational order upon the material world for the sake of commerce and control. The French revolutionaries who championed the metric system were, in their own way, new pharaohs. They sought to sweep away the chaotic patchwork of pre-revolutionary measures, over 250,000 local variants, which empowered local lords and hindered national trade and taxation. By replacing them with the meter and the kilogram, they were centralizing authority, creating a transparent, unified economic space that strengthened the new state. It was the same motive that drove Hammurabi to fix the shekel, just wrapped in the language of Enlightenment reason rather than divine decree. The metric system did not end the story of measurement as power, it simply wrote the next chapter with a different pen. So we stand today between two great lineages. One whispers of marching legions and the measured pace of empire, a system built from the body up. The other speaks of calculated meridians and universal constants, a system imposed from the cosmos down. They seem like opposites, yet they are siblings in purpose. Both answer that primal, civilizing urge to replace the chaos of individual perception with a shared, verifiable truth. Whether you measure your height in feet or meters, you are participating in a tradition of order that allowed the first cities to store grain, the first empires to build roads, and the first global traders to weigh silk against silver. The ruler in your drawer and the scale in your kitchen are not just tools, they are the quiet, everyday descendants of the most profound invention in human history, the agreement that enabled us to build the world together. And that agreement, whether stamped with a king's seal or calculated from the Earth's curve, remains our most fundamental contract. So we arrive at the central, quiet truth of this entire journey. The sword conquered territory, but it was the ruler that governed it. The pharaoh's decree might echo across the desert, but it was the measured brick that gave it physical form. We have traced a story not of a single invention, but of a fundamental shift in human organization, where the silent technologies of the cubit, the shekel, and the Modius emerged as the primary, not secondary, architecture of power. These were not mere administrative conveniences, they were the very operating system of empire, the invisible grid upon which history's first global systems were built. Consider the impossible tasks they made routine. Taxation at a distance is the lifeblood of any state, but how do you collect it from a province a month's travel away? You cannot send an army to seize random piles of grain. The answer was the standardized measure. By defining the who in China or the talent in Persia, a central authority could issue a simple, unambiguous command: deliver 500 talents of silver. Officials in the province collected local goods, converted them, and weighed the silver against the official standard. When the scale balanced, the obligation was met. This transformed plunder into predictable revenue, allowing a throne room in Persepolis to budget for armies and monuments with a clarity never before possible. The measured talent was the sinew that connected the empire's limbs to its heart. That revenue then funded the colossal projects that defined imperial ambition. The pyramids of Giza, the Royal Road, the Roman aqueducts, these were not miracles of brute force, but triumphs of logistical coordination made possible by shared measurement. 1,000 brickmakers along the Nile could produce identical blocks because their molds were based on the royal cubit. Teams of laborers could work on opposite ends of a wall, confident their sections would meet because they were building to the same plan, drawn to the same scale. The project manager did not need to be on-site for every task. He could trust the standard to communicate his intent across time and space. The monument was not just built, it was assembled from prefabricated certainty. This same precision supplied the armies that defended these empires. A legion on the Rhine frontier did not live off the land. It was fed by a supply chain stretching back to Sicilian granaries. A quartermaster could calculate the exact need for 5,000 men for a month, because the Modius of grain and the Amphora of wine were fixed quantities. He could order that amount, have it shipped in standardized containers on roads measured in miles, and know precisely what would arrive. The Roman soldier's daily bread was a direct product of imperial measurement, a daily reminder that the state's power reached him not only through his commander's orders, but through the consistent fullness of his ration bag. Most profoundly, these standards built the networks of trust that enabled global trade. On the Silk Road, where no single law ruled, the balanced scale and the carved weight became the universal translator. A Chinese merchant and a Sogdian trader might share no language, but they could watch a beam settle, agreeing on the physical truth of a liang of silk. This created a fragile but resilient web of commerce across continents, a web woven from mutual faith in a shared standard. The stamped weight was a portable promise, a fragment of order that made dealing with a stranger less of a gamble. Therefore, to see the cubit as a simple tool or the shekel as just a weight is to miss their revolutionary nature. They were the first true information technologies, a way to encode complex instructions, economic value, and legal agreements into a universally understood physical language. They turned the chaotic diversity of local custom into a coherent, manageable system. The emperor's sword could carve out a territory on a map, but it was his standard measures that filled that map with roads, granaries, markets, and the flowing streams of silver and grain that sustained it all. They formed the immutable grid of trust and calculation upon which the ambitions of kings and the fortunes of merchants could finally be projected at a global scale. In the end, the greatest invention of the ancient world was not the wheel, the sail, or even writing. It was the agreement to measure together, for in that agreement lay the blueprint for everything that followed. The story of measurement is ultimately one of dualities. It was a tool of immense control, allowing kings to tax and armies to march, yet it was also a platform for profound cooperation, enabling strangers to trade and cities to rise. This quiet revolution in weights and measures did not merely support empires, it constituted them. The shared language of the cubit and the shekel turned collections of people into coherent societies, transforming human potential from a scattered whisper into a coordinated force. That ancient impulse to find common ground, literally and figuratively, has never left us. Today, we no longer build empires of stone and silver, but we erect vast digital kingdoms of information and commerce. And these new realms run on a new generation of silent standards, the protocols that govern the internet, the data formats that allow a photo taken on one phone to be seen on any computer, the binary code that is the true language of our age. These are our modern cubits and shekels. They are the agreed-upon measures that allow our global network to function, the invisible grid upon which our digital lives are built. We have traded the balance scale for the encryption key, the royal cubit for the application programming interface, but the underlying principle remains unchanged. We build together by first agreeing how to measure our world, so the next time you stream a movie from another continent or send a file across the planet in seconds, pause for a moment. Consider the hidden standards at work, the unspoken agreements that make such miracles mundane. Look around your own daily life at the USB port that fits every device, the Wi-Fi signal that connects you invisibly, the time on your phone synchronized with an atomic clock. These are the latest chapters in humanity's oldest story, the endless quest to find a common ruler. We are still building empires, not of land, but of light and data, and we are still using the same foundational tool, the quiet, revolutionary power of a measure we all agree to trust.